as would happen today, I actually saw an update on a web page where they were saying that Somali pirates have actually released the crew and a vessel that they've been holding captive upon the payment, I think was 5 million USD ransom or something. So yes, I was like, interesting update on a day like today. So the group that is supposed to lead us in our session, are we here?
Yes, we are, Mwalimu.
And as we are having this discussion, remember that one of the crimes world over that is accepted to be heinous before even war crimes and crimes against humanity, or rather the crimes and the Rome Statute, the first crime was the crime of piracy. That is the one that aptly led to the kind, was the one that was encapsulated under customary international law as a crime against all mankind. So for those leading us today, please, you may proceed. I will be interjecting as we go along.
Mbaru, please present your screen, the slides. Okay, this is group 5 and we are tackling piracy. The group members are Wendo Gidaka, Janet Kamolo, Michael Mbaru, myself, Bosto Mkindi, and Hope Audrey. I'll be starting, and you won't hear from Michael Mbaru today because he'll be the one turning our slides. So I'll be starting and then give way to Wendo. Afterwards, it will be Audrey, Janet, and then Bosco will conclude our presentation. Please, with the next. Yeah, so we were handling the nature of piracy. So as Mwalimu has just mentioned, piracy is the oldest crime. Its first historical notes date back to around 400 BC in Greece, and it's the first international crime, a crime that transcends all borders. So the nature of piracy and its definition is just a codification of the definition, because it being an old crime, there needed to be a codification of an acceptable definition of it, because there were various definitions owing to it being such an ancient crime and its complications. So in our presentation, we're going to tackle its nature, and under its nature, we're just going to determine whether it's an international or transnational crime. We will also tackle its various definitions, the elements of the crime of piracy, violence, detention. The elements are violence, detention, and depredation. Its limitation to acts for private ends. The two-ship requirements, its limitation to the high sea, and the punishment for piracy and suppression against acts of violence offenses. So I'll be handling the nature. So piracy is defined under Article 101 of the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea as consisting of any illegal acts of violence or detention that are committed for private ends. Private ends means that they are committed for personal gain. These are crimes that are committed for private ends on the high seas against another ship or aircraft, or voluntary participation in the operation of such vessels that have been captured for the purposes of piracy, or any act or of inciting or of intentionally facilitating the commission of the two acts. The two acts are acts of violence or detention and voluntary operation of the ships that have already been captured. Arising from its jurisdictional element, where the crime of piracy must have taken place in the high seas, that is beyond the 12 nautical territorial sea, we can infer that it's a transnational crime. Moreover, in Article 105 of the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea, it states that prosecution for the crime can be done outside the jurisdiction of any state, whereby any state can seize a pirate vessel, it can make arrests, it can seize the property, and it can determine the course of action to be taken with regards to the vessel that has been captured or the property that has been captured. This is subject to the state that is prosecuting acting in good faith. From this, we note that there lacks an established universally accepted court or tribunal to prosecute the crime of piracy. And if you arising from this, you can see that because we lack an established universally accepted court or tribunal, there have been arrests that have been made, but then with lack of guidelines, sometimes we just end up releasing such pirates because it's subject to national laws and all. States can just prosecute and determine what the level of what the outcome should be. So some states are strict in it, like Yemen, Osman, most Middle East countries, but then piracy like in Somalia, which is quite common in the Indian Ocean, there is no established universally accepted court or tribunal. So there have been discussions to set up one in Nairobi, but that has not yet been forthcoming. On the other hand, international crimes are primarily grave human rights violations, and they do not have to fulfill the jurisdictional element of transcending boundaries and are prosecuted at the International Criminal Court. So owing to this, you can tell the difference between piracy being a transnational crime and it not being an international crime, because it transcends borders and there is it transcends borders, which is a key element for a crime to be a transnational crime. So I'll pass the baton to the next presenter to go deep into the definition.
Thank you, Linda. My name is Wendo Gizaka, and I'll be taking you through the definition of the crime of piracy as well as the elements of the crime of piracy. So when you talk about the definition of the crime of piracy, its historical nature is characterized by the fact that piracy existed since men first set sail. Historically, as maritime commerce grew, so did incidents of piracy. I think one of the best depictions of piracy, especially when it comes to pop culture, is Pirates of the Caribbean, because it's an honest depiction of how piracy was when it comes to the 1560s to the 1720s. At that point, piracy, because of piracy, some rigid rules had to be developed. That came about the Rhodian Sea Laws, which were the first attempt at codifying maritime law, and they consisted of the customs of the Greeks. Afterwards, the development of universal jurisdiction as it pertains to piracy reflected in numerous international laws, and that came because piracy has always been recognized as part of customary international law as one of the two truly international crimes of universal jurisdiction. The other was slave trade. So when that happened, a committee was set up by the Harvard Research Program to consider the international law of piracy independently of the efforts of the League of Nations. And that,
just a moment. Hold on, sorry. Let me just, on that historical part, let me add something before you come to the Harvard draft, because that is what you want to talk about. Now, as you have rightfully said, piracy is one of those crimes that has been going on since time immemorial. And the interesting thing is that piracy meant different things to different people. You've watched movies about the Vikings. The Vikings actually used to engage in piratical acts, but that is not what they were called, right? So you have acts that were considered piratical in nature. Then you had communities that were considered piratical, for example, the Vikings. Interestingly, piracy was even at one point actually condoned by states. Before it became this international crime that is abhorred, piracy was actually condoned by states, and states would even pay rewards for engaging in it. The catch is that it was not, the term used was a very interesting term, which I have put on the chart, and that is the term of privateering. That is the term that was used. And some of Long John Silver, if you watch some of those, old English movies, some of those famous people actually were privateers. And what would happen is privateers would be paid by the state to attack vessels of other countries and plunder them, whatever it is they had on board, whether it is material goods like gold, cloth, whatever, to plunder it. And by bringing this wealth back to the state, they would either be paid handsomely for it or be paid a portion in terms of what they had already plundered. Some would even get titles. It was actually a prestigious thing, but it was actually engaging in piracy. But now it was, because it was beneficial to the then reigning powers, it was given the term of privateering. And eventually now, developments, it started fizzling out. And that is where now we are moving to now having piracy declared an abhorrent crime by all or majority of the states. But that is one very interesting historical aspect about it, that even states would actually pay for piracy to take place before it became this bad crime. You can proceed.
Thank you. So a committee was set up in 1932 by the Harvard Research Program to consider the international law of piracy independently of the efforts of the League of Nations. So this draft produced a definition in which they had terms such as rape, wound, enslave, and imprison. However, this was controversial because there are no definite cases supporting the inclusion of these crimes in the definition of piracy, no matter how heinous these crimes may be. So this draft led to the definition of the crime of piracy in the High Seas Convention, Article 15, and this states, as in the slide in front of you, which is also Article 101 of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. The reason for the replication of the definition from the High Seas Convention to the Law of the Sea Convention was because it would have been easier not to start debating the different opinions on how to define piracy. So now, kindly go to the next slide. On the elements of the crime of piracy. Oh, sorry. So the Merchant Shipping Act of Kenya has also replicated the Article 101 of the Law of the Sea Convention because Kenya has ratified it, and the definition is the same. Can we go to the next slide?
Now, if I may say something, please just go back to the previous slide and talk about that Harvard definition. For UNCLOS, before the definition of piracy was actually agreed, when you read the history, it was actually a very, how do I say? The word is not turbulent. There was a lot of emotion among states before they could finally agree on this definition in Article 101 of UNCLOS. And this we are able to identify having read the historical information. Okay, when you read the documents, the historical documents of the negotiations process, is where you realize that it took a lot before states could actually agree. And that is where, for example, you understand why they had to settle that for piracy, it had to occur in the high seas, because high seas belongs to no one, doesn't belong to any state. Because if an act of plundering occurs within the territorial waters of a state, then that is not considered piracy. That is considered some form of maritime crime, but strictly speaking, not piracy. Piracy must, these elements that you're seeing here in Article 101 must be there for a particular act to be considered piratical or piracy. So that historical element was very interesting. It was a trading kind of negotiation process before this definition could actually be accepted. And if you want to read more about it, if you follow the link that I have shared on the chat, the two links, whichever one, they all lead to the same. If you actually read chapter 1 of that document, it properly traces the history of piracy and in details discusses the UNCLOS and the SUA definition of piracy, which we are going to consider soon. Continue.
Thank you. So the elements of the crime of piracy. So the elements of the crime of piracy come out so that you can be able to distinguish piracy from other crimes. So the line between piracy and other acts of violence are can often blur. For example, in the case of the hijacking of the Achille Lauro, which will be discussed by my colleague further below, the line between piracy and terrorism was blurred. So the similarity of the acts constituting both offenses lends itself to the adaptation of Van Ginkel's model, which requires the following elements to be defined: the status of the perpetrators, the actors' viewers, the target of the act, the geographic scope of the offense, and the mens rea, which includes the ends or the purpose of the act. Can you go to the next slide? So, because the Law of the Sea Convention lacks the required specificity to adequately fill all the necessary elements, the clause of Article 101 brings forward these elements, which are the violence, detention, or depredation. So Article 101 defines piracy in broader than acts committed animo furandi. Animo furandi meaning with the intent to steal. So any illegal act of violence or detention or any act of depredation. The second element is the limitation to act for private ends. So under the customary definition, an attack carried out by the armed forces of a state or an unrecognized belligerent power on vessels of the state with which they are at war is not piracy. The attack has to be made for private ends. So even in this case, if it was maybe a terrorist attack, it wouldn't, even though it could have the semblance of piracy, it wouldn't count because the end of the attack is because of an ideological belief. The third element is the two-ship requirement. Can we go to the next slide? The two-ship element reflects the fact that jurisdiction over acts occurring on a vessel on the high seas lies with the state in which that vessel is registered. So if it was an internal seizure, that would not fall in the realm of universal jurisdiction, but national criminal laws. So this implies that a seizure must originate from another ship and that criminal acts by the crew or a mutiny against a captain will not fall under the scope of piracy. And this happened in the case of the Achille Loro case, and it will be explained further by my colleague. And the last element is the limitation to the high seas. So Article 101A of the Law of the Sea Convention limits piratical acts to those taking place on the high seas or in other places outside of the jurisdiction of any state. So if you did Law of the Sea last semester, you're able to draw distinctions between the high seas, the territorial waters, internal waters, and the demarcations that are made when you use nautical miles. So this limitation to the high seas is a very important factor because, for example, when you think of the case in Somalia, where territorial waters are indeterminate, the zone of criminality is also indeterminate. And the pirates know about this and they take advantage of this fact. So the highly problematic jurisdictional limitation means that states cannot use the Law of the Sea Convention as a basis for enforcement action against pirates within the territorial waters of other states, which is a problem that is acutely seen in Somalia. So thank you. My colleague can take over.
Good evening. My name is Hope Audrey. I'm going to take us through the difference between piracy and other maritime crime like armed robbery at sea and unlawful interference with
Just
ships.
a moment. There's a question. Suppose today Somali pirates are seized and arrested by the Kenyan Navy on the high seas, and then under interrogation, they reveal that they're actually privateers. Okay, one, privateers no longer exist. It's no longer an acceptable term. Privateers on behalf of the Somali government, does that make the intention of the pirates public because they work on, does that make the intention of the pirates public because they work for an elected government? And if so, is it an act of war or still piracy by Somalia? One, piracy cannot be done by a state. Piracy is undertaken by individuals, right? If you look at the definition, and I'll go back just now, piracy can only be done by individuals. A state cannot engage in piracy, okay? Now, that would be a very interesting case because, strictly speaking, then, that is not piracy because it does not fulfill the requirements. Remember, in this particular example, Kevin, that you have put, the private ends that it is not for the benefit of the state, it's not for the benefit of a particular government, but it should be for private ends, for the individuals actually engaged in that act. So this particular scenario would not tick the box for piracy as defined under UNCLOS because of that particular requirement. Yes? Does that answer your question, or do you want to clarify? Chelsea, your hand is also raised.
Yes, Dr. Constance. I have a question in regards
Yes.
to the issue of piracy having existed since time immemorial, yet piracy is actually being prosecuted domestically or regionally. So my question is, despite it being a global concern, why are there still challenges when it comes to bringing the pirates to book after they have committed the crime of piracy?
Because of, how do I put it? Because UNCLOS, for one, never solved that problem. There was no avenue provided for under UNCLOS where you have a unitary court of law to deal with piracy. it was actually now left to the states. Each state was given the permission to try pirates. So anyone capturing pirates in the sea, remember all the rules of when we are dealing with transnational crimes and trying to establish jurisdiction, the same rules here would apply, honestly. And in addition to that, this being a crime of not contemporary, what do we call it? Customary international law. For one, meaning that piracy being a crime of customary international law, states do not need to have ratified UNCLOS for this provision to be applicable to them. It is by virtue of being a crime of customary international law, it is believed every state knows about the crime of piracy as is defined. So this is one of those offenses, one of the very few offenses that has attained that level of being considered a customary law offense crime under international law. Now, as I was saying, the fact that jurisdiction was granted to any state. So the different elements we discussed when we were talking about how to establish jurisdiction over dealing with transnational crimes would apply in this case of piracy. So for example, the flagship involved, right? The state, the ship flies the flag of a particular country where it's registered. That country can act. The country of the people on board who suffer can take, can claim jurisdiction to try the pirates. At the same time also, it is open to the fact that any other state that captures these pirates can exercise jurisdiction. And that was one of the very thorny aspects, as you're saying, when it came to dealing with the Somali pirates at during the height of what was happening from around 2008 to 2013. Because these people, no one wanted to touch them because of the implications that come with it. We have to prepare the trial, collect evidence, conduct it. If you're found guilty, we have to house you. That is. So states did not want to do. And as at that point, because of how piracy was so bad, that is why MOUs were signed. Kenya and Seychelles and Mauritius were some of the states that signed that MOU and agreed that should pirates be captured, they will be willing to prosecute. And that is how the Shanzu Law Court was designated as the court for trying pirates. Even renovations were done to it, etc. Because of that MOU, because states were now not willing to take on the burden. So essentially, the key thing why, despite it being such an old crime, why no one wants to take to step in is because of the implication, what comes with it. So we arrest you, so we have to house you in our jail, we have to collect evidence, we have to take you through the trial process, then if found guilty, we incarcerate you at our cost. That is generally why states do not want to be involved in piracy trials. I hope that answers your question, Chelsea.
Yes, it does. Thank you very much.
Malim, before the presenter continues, I'd like to also refer the class to a civil appeal number 113 of 2011, whereby the Kenya pronounced itself to have jurisdiction to try piracy cases, and that was a judgment by David Maraga then when he was at the Court of Appeal. So if you can appraise yourself with the civil appeal number 113 of 2011, then you could also apprise yourself of how it was argued that Kenya has jurisdiction over piracy cases. Thank you. Please hope.
Okay, I'm going to cut a difference between other related crimes like armed robbery at sea and unlawful interference with ship. Entails all the elements of piracy that has been covered by our previous presenters. So acts of piracy.
Let me interrupt you again. Sorry, I have just seen something. Let me interrupt you to emphasize. This first part A of the UNCLOS definition, if you go through it carefully, you realize, again, even the question of Somali that had been asked on the chat, why it cannot apply. It says piracy means, right? Remember also when we use certain terms, what we mean when dealing with legislation. Meaning we can't go out this definition. We must contextualize whatever facts we have within this definition. So piracy means any illegal act of violence. So it could be an act of violence without necessarily stealing or without involving depredation, meaning to take away, right? Any act of violence or detention or any act of depredation committed for private ends. Note, most important, committed for private ends. So that takes away where the motive involves some political agenda or some motivation for the government. That does not apply. By the crew or the passengers of a private ship or a private aircraft. Again, very specific. Private ship, private aircraft. Clearly being very specific so as to exclude situations where government vessels may be involved. So if the facts relate to a government vessel, then that cannot be piracy because it's not a private ship. Then continues that act of violence, detention, or depredation must be committed on the high seas against another ship or against persons or property on board such ship. Okay? So those acts must happen in the high seas. What we would say, no, the high seas belongs to no one. Next slide. Against persons or property in a place outside the jurisdiction. It can also happen where it is against a ship, persons, or property in a place outside the jurisdiction of any state, right? That implies a situation where maybe it is not happening on the high seas, but it is a place where no state has or exercises jurisdiction, okay? Also, piracy will involve any act of voluntary participation in the operation of a ship or of an aircraft with knowledge of facts, making it a private aircraft. So you may not have known. Eventually, you get to know that it is a pirate ship, but you continue with those acts. You yourself now have become a pirate, okay? Or any act, and this now, the section C deals with inchoate offenses, what we call assisting offenses, where you're acting probably as an accessory. So any act of inciting or of intentionally facilitating an act described in subparagraph A or B, that will also be termed as an act of piracy. So you helped, for example, to acquire the weapons that are necessary for the piratical acts to take place. Then you can be deemed to have intentionally facilitated piracy to have taken place. And by virtue of this section C, you will be charged with the offense of piracy. Now that is the definition of piracy according to UNCLOS. And I'm sure the team will talk about how we came about having different definitions, because clearly this definition that we have has its limitations. So what if you have more than 2 ships involved? Because in this particular definition, it's very clear, 2 ships involved. What if it's done for, the acts are done for political motive and not for private ends? That is for private benefit. What happens? Any question before the team continues?
Just a clarification. So you have mentioned that based on this definition, it has to be done by private ships for private reasons, but it can be done to a ship belonging to a state. It's not, it's the doer who has to be private, but the object now of the crime can be the state.
Go back again. Go back. That again now, that makes it tricky. Okay. Any illegal act of violence or detention or any act of depredation committed for private ends by the crew or the passengers of a private ship or a private aircraft and directed on the high seas against another ship or against persons or property on board such ship. Now, in some jurisdictions, that is not acceptable. They say that both ships must be within the hands of private individuals. However, there is even case law from America where the situation you are talking about has arisen, that the vessel involved that was attacked was actually belonging to a state. And in that particular case, yes, it was held that it was piracy. But then again, it will be interesting to note that the US does not apply the UNCLOS definition. They utilize the SUA convention definition. So strictly speaking, it may be possible, depending for piracy using UNCLOS, we talk of two private ships or a private ship attacking another one. But yes, attacking a government vessel, strictly not piracy. Okay, Somali, suppose the same Somali arms pirates to attack ships in the high seas. Does it mean then that a public institution working? No, it can't. Gitonga, it can't. Right? Because here you have the state involved and it's for public ends. According to UNCLOS, that will not fall within the definition of piracy. Actually, you'll realize it is the constriction, the narrowness in the definition of UNCLOS that led to the enactment of the other important convention dealing with maritime offenses. And that particular, the SUA convention, that is, even did away, it does not talk of piracy. It talks of maritime offenses so that it could open up the limitations that are experienced in applying the UNCLOS definition. Let me allow the team to continue first, then I will interject later. Yes, continue, sorry.
Okay, piracy, armed robbery at sea, and unlawful interference with ship are all criminal activities at sea. They differ in their location and the nature of the acts involved. Now, piracy happens in the high seas. Okay, let's go to armed robbery at sea. So, armed robbery against ship in accordance with the Code of Practice for the Investigation of Crimes of Privacy and armed robbery against ships of the International Maritime Organization Assembly Resolution is defined as any act of violence or retention or any act of depredation or threat thereof other than an act of piracy committed for private ends and directed against a ship or against persons or property on board such as ship within a state's internal waters, archipelagic waters, and territorial sea. Now, the elements of piracy most commonly identified are those set out in Article 101 of UNCLOS, And the elements for armed robbery are also the same with the one of piracy, except that it does not occur on the high seas, but within the territorial sea, archipelagic waters, and territorial sea. Next slide.
Just a moment here. To emphasize, you need to look at Article 103 also of UNCLOS that defines a pirate ship, right? And the provision is that it is intended by the persons in dominant control to be used for the purpose of committing the acts of detention, whatever. What that also implies is this: a ship may not be piratical at the beginning, but it may be converted into a piratical ship if, say, those on board, right, gain dominant control, and turn that vessel into one that they use to attack other ships. Then that ship now, although it was a good ship, using the term good, has now been converted into a pirate ship. So look at Article 103 of UNCLOS that further defines that principle of what a pirate ship is. And as I said, governmental ships are not included or cannot commit piratical acts simply because they are deemed to be acting under the lawful authority of a state. Hence, they cannot, right? But as I said, I've actually identified the case that I was talking about is the SS mother tongue influence, Mayaguez, okay? SS, yeah. This is a case that, and it's an American case that will tell you that dilemma, discusses that dilemma of, it involved a US merchant ship carrying general cargo. Now, the merchant ship was captured by a Cambodian ship that was controlled by Cambodian forces. Now, then, the US government did not recognize the Khmer Rouge regime and thus considered the Cambodian ship a private ship, right? So diplomatic means had to be used to try and secure the release of the vessel. But after 2.5 days, there was no change, right? So the US government therefore launched a military rescue operations. US Marines boarded there and rescued, right? Now, the implication was that according to the US government, the capture of the vessel was an incident of piracy. However, the Chinese government considered the recapture of the Mayaguez an act of piracy. And here it's simply a case of politics, right? Because the Cambodian ship was a government, the question is, was the Cambodian ship a government vessel or a private vessel? And this was hinged or was predicated on the political issue of whether the US recognized the Khmer Rouge as a legitimate authority or not. So the Chinese government are saying the Khmer Rouge is a legitimate authority. The US is saying no. Okay, so that since according to the Chinese, it was a government vessel, it was not a private vessel, then it did not fulfill the UNCLOS two-ship requirement. Hence, it was not a pirate ship. So that was not an act of piracy. Okay. Then we've said the other aspect when you think of two ship, remember you're talking of two ships, one belonging to the pirates and the other belonging to the victims, right? That is traditionally the way we think of piracy. You have the pirates on one ship and you have the victims in the other ship. So that also helps to explain this element of two ship, okay? But what about a situation where the pirates nowadays may be in two or more different vessels, and they use these different vessels to target another vessel, okay? so that the pirates organize themselves, they use 3 vessels to attack just one. Does this same definition apply? Because this UNCLOS definition, when you critically analyze it, it is more or less talking about 2 vessels. Anyway, those are some of the conundrums of UNCLOS. And actually, this is what led to the development of the SUA regime, the other convention that now deals with maritime offenses. And I don't know, before you talk about armed robbery, I think it would be relevant to highlight how the SUA convention came to be, what led for states to realize that there was need to draft a new convention dealing with matters related to illegal acts or crimes occurring at sea. Yes, you can continue. But I'm from the slide I'm seeing, there is a need to tell people how we got here. Simply, SUA Convention is the Convention for the Suppression of Unlawful Acts Against the Safety of Maritime Navigation, referenced in short as SUA, the SUA Convention. Now, this particular convention they felt there was a need to come up with it after the Achille Lauro incident, right? And this particular incident highlighted 2 main weaknesses with the UNCLOS convention. That was the motive requirement element. Remember, we've talked about the motive requirement, that it must be for private ends, and the 2-ship requirement, right? And also, sorry, there are 3. The third element was that of piracy that is committed within territorial waters. UNCLOS convention says piracy can only take part in the high seas. There is the 2-ship requirement. Now, this is what happened with the Achille Lauro incident. On 7th October 1985, 4 men who are members of the Palestinian Liberation Front, PLO, which is a faction of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, posed as passengers and boarded an Italian flagged vessel it was a cruise ship called the Achille Lauro, and they boarded it at Genoa. They then proceeded to hijack the ship as it was sailing within Egyptian territorial waters. And this was in between Alexandria to Port Said. Now, the reason why they did this is because they wanted to pressure the government of Israel to release 50 Palestinians held in their jail. Now, so clearly this incident highlighted the flaws of UNCLOS, right? In this case, the motive was political. They were not interested in any monetary gains. Their interest was to pressure the Israeli government to release the Palestinian prisoners, right? There was no second ship involved. These people posed as cruise ship passengers, and they did not launch an attack on another ship. They launched, the attack on the same ship, right? The incident also occurred within the territorial waters of Egypt, since the ship was hijacked while sailing from Alexandria to Port Said. So that clearly highlighted the weaknesses of attempting to apply UNCLOS, right? So the international community realized there was a need to draft a new convention. And that is how steps were undertaken to oversee the negotiation and the drafting of the Convention for Suppression of Unlawful Acts Against the Safety of Maritime Navigation, the SUA Convention, which was adopted in Italy, Rome on 10th March 1998, but came into force on 1st March 1992. And Article 3 now defines maritime offenses, right? So according to Article 3, SUA does not outlaw piracy, but captures or uses the terms maritime offenses, right? And that was trying now to address that issue of UNCLOS. You may now proceed.
Okay, let us now look at the Merchant Shipping Act definition of armed robbery against ship. Defines it as any unlawful act of violence or detention or any act of depredation or threat thereof other than an act of piracy directed against persons or property on board such as a ship within territorial waters or waters under Kenya's jurisdiction. You can see armed robbery at sea occurs in the territorial waters. Piracy occurs on the high seas. That is the difference between the two. Now let's go to the unlawful interference with ship on the next slide. Now, unlawful interference with ship involve a broad range of activity that interfere with the normal operation of vessels like hijacking, sabotage, and terrorism. Therefore, piracy, armed robbery, and unlawful interference with ships all involve criminal activities at sea. They differ in their location, that is, piracy occurs on the high seas, armed robbery at sea occurs in the territorial waters, archipelagic waters, or internal waters of a state. And unlawful interference is just like a broad range of activity that interfere with the normal operation of vessels. Thank you. I'll pass the baton to Janet.
Now, let me just clarify something also. As I've said, are you going to present at any point in time on SUA, the SUA Convention?
Yes, it's going to come further in the presentation.
Okay, then let me hold my horses. Continue.
Okay, my name is Kamolo, and I'll be handling the limitations to the acts for private ends. But before that, let's just understand what it means on private ends. So basically, when we talk about in piracy, the term private ends, it just refers to the intent and motivation behind an act of piracy. So they are essentially personal or financial benefits which are sought after by individuals or groups that are engaging in acts of piracy. And usually it is used in the legal definitions of piracy under UNCLOS, as we have seen above in Article 101. And also, the concept of private ends is very important because we need to distinguish acts of piracy from other forms of maritime crime or terrorism, because pirates are usually motivated by greed, by personal gain, rather than political, ideological, or state-sponsored motives. Therefore, the pursuit of private ends sets piracy apart as a very distinct criminal offense under international law. So in order for individuals to be prosecuted, it requires demonstrating that their actions are committed for private ends, okay? So basically, for example, looting, they're extorting money, but they cannot be for any legitimate maritime activities or lawful purposes. So basically, private ends in piracy law refer to the self-serving or profit-driven motivations behind piracy. So now I will go to the limitations. Let me give a small example. In 2010, there was a case of the US and Said. It was a group of Somali pirates that had hijacked German-owned ship in the Gulf of Aden. So basically, the pirates had taken control of this vessel, the German vessel, and its crew with the intention that they wanted money, they wanted ransom in order to release the crew, okay? So during the trial, the prosecution argued that the actions of the pirates were definitely carried out for private ends, especially because they were seeking out ransom for financial gain. And the pirates, especially in this case, they had no political or ideological motives, but were solely interested in profit from the hijacking of the ship. I'll just give a summary because it's long. So one of the main key elements when we're examining limitations to the acts of private ends is that the motive. We have to understand the motive behind the Piracy Act. If the Piracy Act is carried out for private ends, which I have already mentioned, personal gain, enrichment, then yes. I can't see. It may not be considered as piracy, but honestly, traditionally, when we consider piracy, there are acts committed for private ends on the high seas, generally associated with robbery or violence for the purpose of personal enrichment. Okay, one of the major limitations when you consider this is the potential for escalation of violence. Because piracy poses a very great threat for maritime safety, criminals are often targeting ships and they are doing illegal stuff such as theft, kidnapping, hijacking. Because of this threat, many shipping companies and private security firms have deployed armed guards on their board vessels in order to deter and defend themselves against these attacks. However, because of the potential for the escalation of violence, these armed guards may be effective in deterring pirates through the use of lethal force, but it is dangerous. It is dangerous because it can escalate to unpredictable situations. There's a risk of accidental shootings, miscommunication, and so on. So some countries have put in place strict regulations because of this, and they have created legal challenges for shipping companies operating in international waters. The other limitation I'd like to address is the costs and the logistics of hiring armed guards. Basically, the hefty fees for services, the difficulty in smaller shipping companies affording the protection against piracy. So logistics of deploying armed guards on ships is very high, in high-risk areas, is very complex and very time-consuming. The other limitation is that the issue of accountability and transparency in the use of private security. So we've addressed the issue of, there's the need of armed guards, but then while armed guards are meant to protect ships, there have been cases of excessive use of force and human rights violations, especially by private security firms. There's concern for oversight, lack of oversight and regulation. There's also a need for greater accountability and transparency in the use of these armed guards on ships. The other limitation is the challenge of legal complexities. So in the legal frameworks of governing the use of armed guards on ships, it's very complex and it's very different from country to country domestic law. So this can create challenges, especially in terms of compliance with the international maritime laws and also legal repercussions if an accident involving an armed guard occurs. There's also the risk of negative perception, the presence of armed guards. It can sometimes be perceived very negatively, especially by the local community in these piracy-prone areas. Why? Because, there can be tensions and various backlash against shipping companies, which can impact operations systems and reputation of the company. The issue of inconsistency in the quality of training. Are these armed guards properly trained? Are they qualified to handle such threats? So that's very crucial in safety, especially for crew members and passengers. There is also the issue of sustainability and long-term solutions. So when you look at this, that armed guards may provide a very short-term deterrent measure. It's a very short-term deterrent measure. It's not very sustainable when we look at the whole issue of piracy and the roots of piracy, especially poverty, political instability, and lack of governance in certain areas, is what is the core issues. And these are long-term repercussions. If we don't address them and provide long-term solutions, then we're basically mark timing. So the other challenge is that the limitation to acts of private ends is in the determination of the true motives and the intent. Okay, so when you consider pirate acts, they're very complex and they involve, of course, personal gain and other motives, which is very difficult in categorizing them, okay? So one key example I'd like to add on this is a modern case of piracy off the coast of Somalia. In the early 2000s, there was a Somali pirate case, which hijacked a commercial vessel. And then they were demanding, it's just similar to the 2010 one, but it was off the coast of Somalia. And they still demanded ransom payments for the release of ships and crew members. So while the primary motivation is usually the financial gain, it seems as if there is also a political and societal side to this, to the motives, okay? So for example, the lack of a functioning government in Somalia, and also the involvement of local communities in these pirates, because most of the members of the pirates are usually from the communities surrounding the pirate operations. Okay, so there's a very complex blend of motives which makes it very difficult in categorizing these acts, especially incidents of piracy committed for private ends. Okay, so the other issues I would just like to address shortly is the lack of uniformity, especially when we are interpreting and applying the limitations of across jurisdiction. I think Mwalimu mentioned the issue of jurisdiction and international legal frameworks. So there's differences in how various countries address the issue of piracy and the criteria they use in determining which motive the pirates had in carrying out this private act, okay? So this can lead to various inconsistencies, challenges, especially in the prosecution, in addressing how to solve the issues of piracy and so on and so forth. So there's also the issue of political instability, economic hardship, and organized crime, okay? So this makes it very difficult to single out which one is the motive behind these acts. The complexity further complicates efforts, especially in addressing piracy effectively, upholding the limitation to acts of private ends. Okay, so for example, in Southeast Asia, there's a case across the waters of the Malacca Strait and South China Sea. In this area, there's usually piracy incidents that have been linked to organized crime groups, especially in the territorial disputes, which have also implicated on the political instability of the region. So it's basically, it has economic motivations, but we can see that there are also other factors such as political instability and organized crime that influence the basic landscape of piracy. Okay. There's also the issue of technology, sophisticated technology. So nowadays, it's a modern challenge. Okay. So the tactics that have been used, they are very difficult to distinguish because the challenges poses a challenge in distinguishing purely profit-driven activities from the general broader political or criminal objectives. So now we have the challenge of whether are we going to draw a clear line between what are the acts of piracy committed for private ends and also which ones are driven by other motivations. Okay, so there's also other multiple factors, which I will leave there, and then let me go to the next point. So basically, when we are looking at private ends, it can be effective in deterring piracy and enhancing maritime safety. But it's very important for also private security firms and shipping companies to address these limitations, maybe work towards sustainability and effectiveness in combating piracy. Yeah, and I think now I can go to the next slide, please. Yeah, the two ship requirements.
Now, before you continue, Fred Ochieng, I had addressed that issue. That is not piracy because of the meaning of the two ship requirement. Suppose against an individual for piracy can be shown to include both private. No, you have to be clear. And that is why, Kevin, what you're talking about, one, are you using the UNCLOS definition or are you using the SUA definition? Because what you're talking, the example you've given there, the UNCLOS definition will not apply. The proper definition to use would be that under SUA where the individual may be sued for maritime acts or maritime offenses. But strictly under the definition of UNCLOS, that particular individual where there's both a private and a political motive, the SUA convention, I mean, the UNCLOS convention cannot apply. And that is why, Gitonga, I hope you listened to my explanation why SUA came about, because they realized the limitations of UNCLOS. So SUA does not talk of piracy. It actually talks of maritime offenses. So SUA would be applicable. And if you look even at our Merchant Shipping Act, it's actually it's a merge of the two. It provides for the UNCLOS definition of piracy as well as the SUA definitions of maritime offenses, so that individuals will still be held accountable for maritime offenses, though not for the offense of piracy. I hope that clears the confusion. Now, what I was to talk about is the different scenarios you have just highlighted. The motivations why piracy continues. The various examples you've talked for political reasons, for economic reasons, because even society accepts it. Interestingly, if you read even about like when the Somali pirates was at its height, you had a lot of unemployed people, you had a failed government that could not enforce the rule of law. You had a community that was actually benefiting from piracy because the pirates, from using the money locally, would boost the local economy. So the locals were happy. It was something good. So yes, there are different motivations for engaging in piracy. There are some now which are purely, actually, it's what should we say? It's a business. They've now realized that capturing, and that is where, for example, the Somali piracy, we talked about piracy for ransoms. that now it was not even to capture, it was not for purposes of capturing the goods on board the vessel, but the pirates were actually more interested in restraining the passengers on board so that they could negotiate for ransoms. So it was actually piracy for ransoms. You can continue. Or rather, any question? There's no question, you can continue.
Okay, so on the two ship requirement under the UNCLOS of 1982, it defines piracy basically as any illegal acts of violence or detention committed for private ends by the crew or passengers of a private ship or aircraft on the high seas against another ship or aircraft. So one of the key requirements, especially under this, is just this two ship requirement that states that the act of piracy must be committed by the crew or ship of one or passengers of one ship against another ship. Yeah. So in other words, it has to be at least two ships involved in order for this act to be classified as piracy. So it's very important that this requirement helps to distinguish acts of piracy from other types of criminal activities, which my colleague has addressed. So the two ship requirements helps to clarify this definition and ensure that only acts committed on the high seas between two ships are considered as piracy. So it's very important because it triggers specific legal responses and obligations under international law, because such as the right of states to take action against pirates on the high seas and the duty to prosecute or extradite suspected pirates. So overall, we can see that under UNCLOS, it's just clarity and a clear legal framework for addressing acts of piracy on the high seas. Yeah. So in this, I would like to just address a few elements on the two ship requirements, especially in the definition under UNCLOS. The first part is that the illegal acts of, it has to be illegal acts of violence or detention, implying that piracy involves the use of force or coercion, especially in carrying out these illegal activities. It must constitute illegal acts of violence in the context of maritime law and also other gray areas and ambiguities in this in the definition of the act. There's also the issue of private ends, which I have addressed earlier, which just involves implying that piracy is carried out for personal gain rather than for political or state objectives, highlighting that the motives behind such acts, for example, financial gain, revenge, coercion, and also the consideration of how these private ends influence the various dynamics of piracy. The third element of the two ship requirement is it has to be by the crew or passengers of a private ship or aircraft. So this element specifically is that piracy involves actions committed by individuals on board. Okay, if they're outside the vessel, then no, but they have to be on board of the private vessel, and it also includes the role and responsibility that these crew members have played in the acts of piracy. Okay, so we're talking about the power dynamics. They have hijacked or they have taken captive another ship, and they are exercising some form of domination or power over this other ship. Okay, so there's the various factors, for example, the hierarchy, the leadership, the complicity. If they are complicit in this action, then yes, they have contributed to the commission of piracy. And then the other thing is that it has to be obviously against another ship or aircraft. So we cannot just speak about two ship requirements and we exclude the other ship. So piracy entails actions directed at a different vessel. It cannot be in the same vessel, it has to be another vessel. And it also involves various dynamics, okay? So we are talking about encounters between ships at sea. We're talking about the security measures of the ship, the vulnerabilities. We are talking about the location, the navigation routes, the communication, on how they have hijacked or how they have carried out these pirate attacks. Okay, so in the definition, we are basically highlighting very important purposes which are very important. I hope you've gone to the purposes, thank you. Which are very crucial in the understanding of the acts of piracy effectively, okay? So the first thing is that we have to distinguish piracy from other crimes. The requirement that, piracy must involve actions against another ship, aircraft, which helps in differentiation matters of piracy from other crimes or offenses that usually occur on the high seas. So this distinction is very important because obviously for legal and jurisdictional purposes, and also, piracy falls under a very unique, very specific legal framework with very distinct consequences, especially in the enforcement measures. Okay, so when we specify that piracy involves attacks on separate vessels, when we specify that this two-ship requirement helps to clearly delineate the various scope and the nature of these activities, of these pirate activities. Yeah, so that's why it's important. And there's also the issue of a clear legal standard, establishing a clear legal standard. Yes. So the two-ship requirement, it really sets this objective standard for defining piracy under international law, codified under UNCLOS, obviously. And then the standard provides a very legal certainty and predictability, especially when we're looking at how authorities and states and stakeholders will be able to combat these acts of piracy, how they'll be able to identify them in the first place. So when we are talking about requirements, that piracy involve actions against another ship. The two-ship requirement usually it's a specific criterion. So this criteria is very clear in determining when an act qualifies as piracy, which is very important, as I've reiterated, for legal proceedings, investigations, and enforcement by states. Yeah. So let me go to the next. There's also the issue of collective security concern when we are addressing what is the collective security concerns for the international community? Because piracy is not just, it's a transnational crime, it's international in nature. So it raises collective security concerns for the international community, especially when you're focusing on the actions directed at different vessels, the broader implications, especially for maritime security, it implies that it cuts across the maritime domain. So there's just the need for joint efforts, the need for cooperation among states, coordination, and also, quick responses when we are discussing how to combat piracy effectively as countries, that is. So the other thing is international cooperation. Okay, the need for the promotion of international cooperation, encouraging cooperation among states, organizations, and maritime stakeholders. So in this, the actions against, which is this piracy actions against another ship or aircraft, it underscores the shared responsibility of states. Okay, so basically how states are going to prevent, suppress, or prosecute these acts. There's also the need to promote collaboration and information sharing on piracy incidents. Okay, that's why we have this media coverage of these incidents. That's why we have what do we call trends. We look forward to how the trends are in the internet or in the news outlets on how piracy acts are carried out, or the cases in courts. Okay, and then the best practices also states discusses best practices on how to enhance maritime security, how to strengthen the various legal frameworks, and also discussion on the future of pirate acts. Yeah. I think I should give you guys an example. There was a case of the Maria case. It was a long time ago in 1935. In this case, there was a group of individuals. They had attacked a vessel at sea because they wanted to steal their cargo, okay? So the defendants had argued that they could not be convicted of piracy because they had only attacked one ship and had not committed acts of piracy on a second vessel. So the court basically just rejected this because what have we said about the two-ship requirement? It requires, yes, it requires another vessel, but the court here discussed that the element is not necessary for modern piracy law. So Mwalimu, I think you should tell us about this more because the court emphasized the essence of piracy in violence. It just highlighted the criminal intent of the attackers and just discussed rather than the specific number of ships. So it reaffirmed the principle, but it says it's not a strict rule in determining acts of piracy in the broader interpretation. So
that was simply a way of trying to address the shortcomings of UNCLOS. Remember, SUA did not exist then. So it was a way of trying to deal with the situation as currently was there and trying to hold these people accountable upon seeing they could easily get away. So that is why the ship had to find for an ingenious way to address the matter. Okay. Interestingly enough, the solution came many years later through SUA that does not talk of piracy at all. Actually, there's nowhere in the SUA Convention you'll see the term piracy referred to. It uses the terms maritime offenses. So, and which is now helps because all the shortcomings of UNCLOS are done away with, and it's possible to hold people accountable for different maritime offenses, right? For a variety of whatever maritime offense, whether they occur in the territorial sea, the high seas, they will still be held accountable. And regardless of whether it is one ship or it is on two ships or there are no two ships involved, they'll still be held accountable. So that was as an ingenious case of a situation. A state was still trying to hold those who committed the acts accountable. And actually, you need to read, if you look at the discussion at the UNCLOS committee, were actually aligned with the Harvard draft, a draft that had been developed with the auspices of Harvard professors. That is what was finally tabled at the UN, and that is what was eventually negotiated into the UNCLOS definition. And part of it, why it has been now come to be said to be customary international law, because it was a compilation of, the professors had done a research and tried to compile what different jurisdictions define piracy as by then. Okay. Any question? And actually it is 6 minutes past 7. So can we take our 10 minutes break first? So at 16 past, we come to proceed. Right, it is actually we are past. Yes, those presenting, we are back.
So I would like to hand over to Bosco.
You are. Just a moment, sorry. There's something that, just go back to the slide where you're talking about the legal regimes. You've listed them. That's where you talked about the Geneva Convention. Yes. Now, that particular convention you're talking about, Geneva Convention for the High Seas, which I can't see the year, or 1958. Wasn't this particular convention subsumed into UNCLOS by virtue of the fact that the UNCLOS definition adopted verbatim the definition that was there in the Geneva Convention for 1958. They only, actually, the changes are stylistic. Where you attempt to use certain words instead of others, but essentially the crime stated is actually one and the same. Yeah. And then that becomes clear when you look at the historical developments, right? Because the text of the Geneva Convention that you're talking about, 1958, provided the draft upon which further discussions at the UN Conference on the Law of the Sea was to be done. Yeah? And therefore, the commentary on the Geneva Convention acts or aids in the interpretation of a number of the provisions related to piracy. Yeah. So anyway, I just wanted to highlight that point. Yes, go ahead. That particular contact group was created due to the rise of the Somali piracy, as I said, between the period, well, some say it began in 2006, most will talk of 2008 to around 2013. So those were actually measures to try and address piracy then. If you look, the international community actually came up with different measures, like the ones were discussed before. Ship owners started having armed guards on board their vessels. There were situations where the internationally recognized transport corridor was created, and foreign vessels, i.e. that is military vessels, were manning that transport corridor to try and prevent the attack of ships. But there still remained the problem of prosecution. How do you deal with those who are actually arrested? So those were some of the preventative measures that had been implemented. And you realize, as was said earlier, piracy is common in some of these other regions, like the Straits of Malacca, the Gulf of Aden. Those are some of the hotspots for piracy. Hence why even this issue still remains of importance to date. So yes, continue. Any question?
Just before you take questions, Daktari, I think I would like to just show how this issue of piracy is still an issue in the world. There are some reports from the International Maritime Organizations. If you visit their website, you would see that there are monthly updates of some of the piracy activities, and I think recently it has been increasing. There has been a time of quietness in terms of piracy attacks, but now recently we have had a case in Somali. We are also having cases in Red Sea and also Guinea and so forth. And you could see that recently, the month of February, we've been having at least around 24 cases of piracy, different ships being attacked by pirates, such as the Maria bulk carrier, surprise flagged vessel. We also have January having around so many other cases also in January and so forth. So it's an issue that is pressing currently, and I think the International Maritime Organization is trying to address these issues and finding solutions to make sure that they suppress this act of piracy. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Actually, some of those have been hotspots for a very long time. The likes of Guinea have been hotspots for a very long time, just that it is, unless you are specifically looking for the information, you don't become aware of it, but it has constantly been on the radar of the International Maritime Organization. Now, I wish to highlight this aspect of universal jurisdiction in relation to the crime of piracy. Note, I'm talking of the crime of piracy, not maritime offenses. As we know, international law recognizes jurisdiction based on 5 key elements, which we talked about in a previous class. Territorial principle, where the acts committed have a substantial territorial effect on a state, or they are committed within that state's territory. Protective principle, where there is a connection between the act and the national security of a state. You have nationality principle, acts involved have been committed by the nationals of that state. You have passive personality, where the victim is a national of the state asserting jurisdiction. Then you have universality principle, meaning any state may assert jurisdiction over specific crimes, right? And essentially, this one is very restrictive. The first one that states can apply universal jurisdiction is the crime of piracy. The other crimes are slavery, genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. Now, why? The universality principle will apply, or universal jurisdiction will apply to piracy, because piracy has been categorized by the fact that pirates are hostis humani generis, the enemy of all mankind. This is because their actions threaten trade, travel, commerce, and safety of every nation that is utilizing the high seas, right? And as we said, these piratical acts are done outside any state's jurisdiction. That's in the high seas. And that's why universal jurisdiction now applies. And this whole concept was developed by a Dutch scholar named Grotius. We pronounce it the way it is written, for those who don't know, as most people pronounce him as Grotius. But actually the G in Dutch becomes a H, so it's Grotius. And he espoused the principle of freedom on the high seas, the mare liberum. Every state has an equal right of navigation over the high seas. And that is why any state then can arrest any pirate in the high seas, because the high seas don't belong to any state. So they're not infringing on any state's sovereignty. Okay? So that is how then this concept of universal jurisdiction applies to piracy. It does not apply to maritime offenses. For maritime offenses, the other principles of establishing jurisdiction would become relevant or applicable, okay? And as has been explained by the group, the domestication of this particular international law on piracy has been problematic because different jurisdictions have incorporated it differently in their domestic legislation. And because of this inconsistency, holding pirates accountable becomes a problem, okay? Their arrest and trial become a problem. Yet we do not have a convention that provides for an international court that can deal with the issue, okay? And hence why we said, for example, in the case of the Somali pirates, there was a need to have MOUs or agreements with states to agree that any captured pirates would be transferred to their jurisdiction and they would conduct the trials, okay? So these are some of the challenges that are still there, despite this offense having existed for such a long time. There has even been debates whether piracy should be included as one of the crimes in the Rome Statute. But yes, that hasn't yet passed, okay? And this is based on that aspect of universal jurisdiction. But that still has not borne any fruits. And hence, why, as the group has said this, the duty or the need for states to cooperate in the repression of piracy, because all mankind suffers. If you look at what happened during the height of the Somali piracy, the cost of goods skyrocketed because cost of transporting the goods went up tremendously. The duration it took to transport went up. So ultimately, the cost of the final products went up, which had an effect on all states in the world. They felt the implication, okay? So potentially these shortcomings, and the cry has been, could we look also for other different laws, okay, that we could potentially use? One of them could be, for example, the anti-money laundering laws, because like in the case of Somali pirates, where it was piracy for ransoms, so the money gained by way of these ransoms paid was from an illegal crime, the crime of piracy. So hence that's an illegal profit or an illegal benefit that can be targeted for taking away through the money laundering offense. So there has been, an argument that yes, we need to look for other ways to hold the pirates accountable. Yes, Ibrahim.
Yes, Dr. Tari, in the definition, it's mentioned that the piracy also includes inchoate offenses such as aiding. So we see a situation where pirates hijack a ship, and then there is negotiation, a ransom is paid, and then it's released. So this, and even today, there is news in the media that pirate is confirming they were paid $5 million, and they have released. They have released the ship after they confirmed the money was genuine. I think they were afraid that the money that they were paid could be fake or currency. So, Doctor, my question is now this practice of paying ransom, isn't it something encouraging or aiding now this perpetration of this offense of piracy, and that the international legal instrument should also address any act of also aiding this, because if you pay ransom, basically you are supporting the business as such.
Correct, Ibrahim. Correct. And that's now where I'm talking about and saying that a call for using other ways may not strictly be piracy laws, but other laws that can assist to hold them accountable. And that is where, for example, the laws on money laundering become relevant. Because these pirates now who have been paid ransom, it's from an illegal activity, piracy. They will have to use the money. They'll have to clean it one way or the other, because it's dirty money now, having been gained from a criminal offense. So they can be held accountable through money laundering laws. Okay, so, and I agree, it's a controversial issue as to whether they should be paid the ransom. But the question is, without this ransom, innocent people are held hostage for indefinite periods of time, probably some even dying in hostage, in captivity. So it is one of those issues that there's no, what do we say, black and white answer. It's a gray area when it comes to the payment, right? So it is, some states say they will not pay, but you find that, for example, the owners of the ships, they need their vessel. They've invested in it. The families of the victims want their loved ones back home. So that is how these ransoms eventually end up being paid. Yeah. Any other question? As I said, if you, the link that I shared on the chat at the very beginning, if you read chapter 1 of this document, it will give you a very succinct history about the history of piracy and even the problems that we occurred that dealing with piracy, what challenges arise. So have a look at, no, chapter 2, sorry. Is it chapter 2 or chapter 1? Chapter 2, sorry. I think it's chapter 2 of the document that deals, yes, it's chapter 2 of the document that deals with the issue of piracy. Any other question? Okay, if there's no other question, we are lucky enough to have finished early today. Yes, it can be downloaded, Zedekiah. The document can be downloaded. If there's no other question, then
Thank you, Dr.
All right, you're welcome. We will stop here for the day. Do have a restful evening, and inshallah, we shall meet next time.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you.
You
Good
too.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you.